All right, welcome back. Now we are on chapter 26 of Treasure Island. And the name of chapter 26 is Israel Hands. And that is the name of a sailor who is one of the pirates. And what we know about him historically is that he was on Captain Flint's pirate ship along with Long John Silver and the others. And he was a gunner. And the gunner is the guy that runs the cannon. So what we've seen of him so far is that he had taken up some of the responsibilities when Mr. Arrow, way back in the voyage, must have gone overboard, went missing. Israel was kind of promoted to be one of the, under officer types or something. He seemed like a very competent person. He also was one of the people talking to Long John Silver when Jim was in the apple barrel, and he was the one who wanted to get everybody killed sooner rather than later. He just wanted to get it done. So that's not a very good sign. Israel's probably not a nice person. He's a pirate. He likes the idea of killing off the good guys. Yeah, you should be suspicious. And at the beginning of this part 5, My Sea Adventure that Jim is writing about, he sees Israel and the other man that is on the boat with him on the Hispaniola, whose name now turns out to be O'Brien. And he sees O'Brien and Israel Hands fighting. And they do fight a lot after having been drunk. And Israel Hands has killed O'Brien before Jim even gets onto the Hispaniola. So Israel Hands is a bad person. He drinks a lot and he doesn't mind killing people. And speaking of, let's talk about that for a second. There is a lot of alcohol in this story, for a story that is being used for a book that we're teaching in junior high. Now, I want you to think about why this book is okay as a junior high book, but it talks about alcohol. Because there's 2 good reasons. I guess. Anyway, the first thing is, because it's about a culture that's in the 1700s, that was at a time when there was no such thing as a drinking age. Alcohol was served basically to any age person, I guess. And there's a bit of a reason for that. Fermented drinks like alcohol don't go bad over time, at least not the same way that some others do. And so they were very common to have around. Now, they didn't get drunk. That was like a very abnormal thing to do. That was like the kind of thing that very irresponsible, kind of low class individuals would do. Okay. It was different than our culture now because it was just so normal to have it. It wasn't a special thing, it was an everyday thing that they had. Now, when we see alcohol use in this book, it is not in a way that is good at all. The people who like to drink a lot tend to be kind of rotten people. The people who get drunk are definitely rotten people. And so I think that there's a bit of a side message there. If you were to ask the author, Robert Louis Stevenson, what he thinks about drinking, I think he would tell you that it was something that you would have to do responsibly, and that if you overdid it, that you would end up in a lot of trouble. Because the people in this book who overdo it are in a lot of trouble. Now we have some presuppositions, that's what those are called, about Israel Hands, what we already know about him and what we can suspect about him. And we already know not a very good guy, and already know that he's not somebody to be trusted. Okay? All right. Okay, a little note again, if you're just joining me at this chapter, I do this in my house. My house is full of my family and dogs and noise and such. I'm not even trying anymore to do anything with my hair. It's, what are you going to do? Quarantine hair. It's awful. So just bear with me. It's still, I think, worthwhile to read and discuss with other people. And this chapter is one of my favorites. And I gotta question that because I tend to like the really violent ones. Spoilers. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and read this one, and then we'll talk about it at the end. Israel Hands. Oh, and remember, as we just left off, Israel and Jim are the only 2 on the Hispaniola. and Israel is helping Jim by telling him what to do. He's helping him sail the boat, and they're taking it to the North Inlet, which is a good place to like stop the boat. Okay, so they can keep it safe for people to get back on it. Okay, kind of important. If you're on an island, having a ship is good. Okay, here we go. The wind, serving us to a desire, now hauled into the west. We could run so much the easier from the northeast corner of the island to the mouth of the North Inlet. Only, as we had no power to anchor and dared not beach her till the tide had flowed a good deal farther, time hung on our hands. The coxswain told me how to lay the ship to. After a good many trials, I succeeded, and we both sat in silence over another meal. Let me kind of revisit this one a little bit. They can't anchor the boat. There's no anchor. The hawser line was cut by Jim, okay? And they can't beach it, meaning run it up until the tide flowed all the way in. So what you want to do is you want to get it as far up to the beach as possible. And then when the tide goes out, it's on the beach, and then has to wait for the tide to come back in before you can get it to loosen up and go. So you can't beach it during ebb tide and hope that it's there the next day, because as the tide comes in, it'll just float it right away. Okay, so they're waiting till the right time to go in. Cap'n, he said at length with that same uncomfortable smile, here's my old shipmate O'Brien. Suppose you was to heave him overboard. I ain't particular as a rule, and I don't take no blame for setting his hash, but I don't reckon him ornamental now. Do you? He's talking about the dead guy. He's like, maybe you could just throw him over. I'm not strong enough, and I don't like the job, and there he lies for me, said I. This here is an unlucky ship, this Hispaniola, Jim, he went on, blinking. There's a power of men been killed in this Hispaniola. A sight of poor seamen dead and gone since you and me took ship to Bristol. I never seen such dirty luck, not I. There was this here O'Brien now. He's dead, ain't he? Well, now, I'm no scholar, and you're a lad as can read and figure. And to put it straight, do you take it as a dead man is dead for good? Or do he come alive again? You can kill the body, Mr. Hands, but not the spirit. You must know that already, I replied. O'Brien there is in another world, and may be watching us. Ah, says he, well, that's unfortunate. Appears as if killing parties was a waste of time. Howsoever, sperits don't reckon for much by what I've seen. I'll chance it with the sperits, Jim. And now you've spoke up free, and I'll take it kind if you'd step down into that there cabin and get me shiver my timbers, I can't hit the name on it. Well, you get me a bottle of wine, Jim. This here brandy's too strong for my head. Now the coxswain's hesitation seemed to be unnatural, and as for the notion of his preferring wine to brandy, I entirely disbelieved it. The whole story was a pretext. He wanted me to leave the deck, so much was plain, but with what purpose I could in no way imagine. His eyes never met mine. They kept wandering to and fro, up and down, now with a look to the sky, now with a flitting glance upon the dead O'Brien. All the time he kept smiling and putting his tongue out in the most guilty, embarrassed manner, so that a child could have told that he was bent on some deception. I was prompt with my answer, however, for I saw where my advantage lay, and that with a fellow so densely stupid, I could easily conceal my suspicions to the end. So you can tell that Israel's up to something, but he thinks he's kind of dumb. And so he's like, I got this. Okay. Some wine, I said. Far better. Will you have white or red? Well, I reckon it's about the blessed same to me, shipmate, he replied. So it's strong and plenty of it. What's the odds? All right, I answered. I'll bring you port, Mr. Hands, but I'll have to dig for it. With that, I scuttled down the companion. That's the door, like hatch that goes down into the ship, with all the noise I could, slipped off my shoes, ran quietly along the sparred gallery. That's underneath the deck, okay? Mounted the forecastle ladder, so he goes up on the other side, popped my head out of the fore companion, the other door, the other hatch, up at the front of the boat, I knew he would not expect to see me there, yet I took every precaution possible, and certainly the worst of my suspicions proved too true. He, Israel Hands, had risen from his position to his hands and knees, and though his leg obviously hurt him pretty sharply when he moved, for I could hear him stifle a groan, yet it was at a good rattling rate that he trailed himself across the deck. In half a minute, he had reached the port scuppers and picked out of a coil of rope a long knife, or rather a short dirk, discolored to the hilt with blood. He looked upon it for a moment, thrusting forth his underjaw, tried the point upon his hand, and then, hastily concealing it in the bosom of his jacket, trundled back again to his old place against the bulwark. This was all that I required to know. Israel could move about. He was now armed, and if he had been at so much trouble to get rid of me, it was plain that I was meant to be the victim. What he would do afterwards, whether he would try to crawl right across the island from North Inlet to the camp among the swamps, or whether he would fire Long Tom, trusting that his own comrades might come first to help him, was, of course, more than I could say. Yet I felt sure that I could trust him in one point. Since in that our interests jumped together, and that was in the disposition of the schooner, we both desired to have her stranded safe enough in a sheltered place, and so that, when the time came, she could be got off again with as little labor and danger as might be. And until that was done, I considered that my life would certainly be spared. So he's thinking, well, he may be out to kill me, and he's going to try to fool me because he's now got a hidden knife, but he's going to wait until we get the boat safe because he needs my help. Okay. While I was thus turning the business over in my mind, I had not been idle with my body. I had stolen back to the cabin, slipped once more into my shoes, and laid my hand at random on a bottle of wine. And now, with this for an excuse, I made my reappearance on the deck. Hans lay as I had left him, all fallen together in a bundle, and with his eyelids lowered as though he were too weak to bear the light. He looked up, however, at my coming, knocked the neck off the bottle like a man who had done the same thing often, and took a good swig with his favorite toast of "Here's luck." Then he lay quiet for a little, and then, pulling out a stick of tobacco, begged me to cut him a quid. And now, they talk about tobacco a lot here. Sometimes they smoke it in pipes, not cigarettes, but in pipes. And then also they have these sticks of tobacco, which is just the rolled up, dried up leaves of tobacco, and they chew it. It's like chewing tobacco, but it's not in a can. It's like they bite it off of a stick, almost like a jerky stick. Ugh. Okay, so, and a quid is a chunk of it. Cut me a chunk of that, says he, for I haven't no knife and hardly strength enough, so be as I had. Ah, Jim, I reckon I've missed days. Cut me a quid as'll likely be the last, lad, for I'm for my long home and no mistake. Okay, he's trying to make sure Jim thinks he's weak and he's unarmed. Well, said I, I'll cut you some tobacco. But if I was you and thought myself so badly, I would go to my prayers like a Christian man. Why, said he, now you tell me why. Why, I cried, you were asking me just now about the dead. You've broken your trust. You've lived in sin and lies and blood. There's a man you killed lying at your feet this moment, and you ask me why? For God's mercy, Mr. Hands, that's why. I spoke with a little heat, thinking of the bloody dirk he had hidden in his pocket and designed in his ill thoughts to end me with. He, for his part, took a great draught of the wine and spoke with the most unusual solemnity. For 30 years, he said, I've sailed the seas and seen good and bad, better and worse, fair weather and foul, provisions running out, knives going and what not. Well, now I tell you, I never seen good come of goodness yet. Him as strikes first is my fancy. Dead men don't bite. Them's my views. Amen, so be it. And now, look here, he added suddenly, changing his tone. We've had about enough of this foolery. The tide's made good enough by now. You just take my orders, Captain Hawkins, and we'll sail slap in and be done with it. It's interesting. Israel Hawkins thinks that good never came of good. Like, you're going to be a good guy, nothing good happens out of it. I hope he's wrong. All told, we had scarce 2 miles to run, but the navigation was delicate. The entrance to this northern anchorage was not only narrow and shoal, but lay east and west, so that the schooner must be nicely handled to be got in. I think I was a good prompt subaltern. It's a position on the ship to be. And I'm very sure that Hans was an excellent pilot, for we went about and dodged in, shaving the banks with a certainty and a neatness that were a pleasure to behold. Scarcely had we passed the heads before the land closed around us. The shores of the North Inlet were as thickly wooded as those of the southern anchorage, but the space was longer and narrower and more like what in truth it was, the estuary of a river. Right before us, at the southern end, we saw the wreck of a ship in the last stages of dilapidation. It had been a great vessel of 3 masts, but had lain so long exposed to the injuries of the weather that it was hung about with great webs of dripping seaweed. And on the deck of it, shore bushes had taken root, and now flourished thick with flowers. It was a sad sight, but it showed us that the anchorage was calm. Okay, so they get in. It's really tight and hard to get into where they are, but they manage it with some skill. Jim's pretty proud of himself. And there's already a shipwreck in this area, a ship that had come into this inlet and never been washed away. Okay, so that's a good sign, because that might be mean it's a good place to put a ship, even though that ship's not in very good shape. Okay. Now, said Hans, look there. There's a pet bit for to beach a ship in. Fine flat sand, never a cat's paw, trees all around of it, and flowers a blowing like a garden on that old ship. It's like, that's a good spot over there, even pretty. And once beached, I inquired, how shall we get her off again? Why, so, he replied, you take a line ashore. They're on the other side at low water. Take a turn about one of them big pines. Bring it back. Take a turn around the capstan and lie to for the tide. Come high water, all hands take a pull upon the line, and off she comes as sweet as nature. And now, boy, you stand by. We're near the bit now, and she's too much way on her. Starboard a little, so steady. Starboard, larboard a little, steady, steady. So Israel's giving him instructions on how to get the boat in there, because it's coming in a little fast for what they need to do. Okay, so he's telling him to be careful and do these things. But Jim got a little bit of info out of him, like, well, how do you get it out? Once you get it beached, how do you get it out? And it takes like putting the ropes around the shores on the trees on shore and using them for leverage to wedge the boat out again. Okay. So he issued his commands, which I breathlessly obeyed, till all of a sudden he cried, now, my hearty, luff! And I put the helm hard up, and the Hispaniola swung round rapidly and ran stem on for the low wooded shore. The excitement of these last maneuvers had somewhat interfered with the watch I had kept hitherto, sharply enough upon the cozen. So he had been watching, but because this was so busy, he kind of stopped watching him. Even then, I was still so much interested, waiting for the ship to touch, that I had quite forgot the peril that hung over my head, and stood craning over the starboard bulwarks and watching the ripples spreading wide before the bows. I might have fallen without a struggle for my life, had not a sudden disquietude seized upon me and made me turn my head. Perhaps I had heard a creak or seen his shadow moving with the tail of my eye. Perhaps it was an instinct like a cat's. But sure enough, when I looked around, there was Hans already halfway towards me with the dirk in his right hand. So Jim was all kind of entranced by watching the boat get closer and closer to the shore. And then a feeling comes on him like, I better turn around. And Israel Hans is halfway to him with his knife out when he turns around. We must both have cried out aloud when our eyes met, but while mine was the shrill cry of terror, his was a roar of fury like a charging bully's. At the same instant, he threw himself forward, and I leaped sideways towards the bows. As I did so, I let go of the tiller. That's the thing that holds the turn that he was making the boat do, right? Which sprang sharp to leeward. And I think this saved my life, for it struck Hans across the chest and stopped him for the moment, dead. Not really dead, just stopped him in his spot. Before he could recover, I was safe out of the corner where he had me trapped, with all the deck to dodge about. Just forward of the mainmast I stopped, drew a pistol from my pocket, took a cool aim, though he had already turned and was once more coming directly after me, and drew the trigger. The hammer fell, but there followed neither flash nor sound. The priming was useless with seawater. I cursed myself for my neglect. Why had not I, long before, reprimed and reloaded my only weapons? Then I should not have been, as now, a mere fleeing sheep before this butcher. So yeah, remember, Jim had those weapons, but has gotten wet and not thought about that. Back then, if your weapons did get wet, you had to reprime. You had to make sure everything was dry and ready to go again. And he could have done that because he knew that he was in danger, but he didn't. Okay. Wounded as he was, it was wonderful how fast he could move. His grizzled hair tumbling over his face, and his face itself as red as a red ensign with his haste and fury. I had no time to try my other pistol, nor indeed much inclination, for I was sure it would be useless. One thing I saw plainly, I must not simply retreat before him, or he would speedily hold me boxed into the bows, as a moment since he had nearly boxed me in the stern. Once so caught, and 9 or 10 inches of the bloodstained dirk would be my last experience on this side of eternity. I placed my palms against the mainmast, which was of goodish bigness, and waited, every nerve upon the stretch. Okay, he's like, I can't outrun him forever. I mean, there's not very many places to go. He's going to get me trapped again. And the mast is the tall, like, long, like the pole that holds up the sail. Okay. Seeing that I meant to dodge, he also paused, and a moment or two passed in feints on his part and corresponding movements on mine. It was such a game as I had often played at home about the rocks of Black Hill Cove, but never before, you may be sure, with such a wildly beating heart as now. Still, as I say, it was a boy's game, and I thought I could hold my own at it against an elderly seaman with a wounded thigh. Indeed, my courage had begun to rise so high that I allowed myself a few darting thoughts on what would be the end of the affair, and while I saw certainly that I could spin it out for long, I saw no hope of any ultimate escape. Well, while things stood thus, suddenly the Hispaniola struck, staggered, ground for an instant in the sand, and then, swift as a blow, canted over to the port side until the deck stood at an angle of 45 degrees, and about a puncheon of water splashed into the scupper holes and lay in a pool between the deck and the bulwark. So just that moment, the Hispaniola runs aground. And when it does, it isn't floating anymore. So it goes tweak. Because remember, if you've seen the pictures that I gave you and pictures of schooners, they have a keel. They aren't flat at the bottom. They have a keel. And so they don't sit flat. So if they're on ground, they go boink. Okay, so that happens very, very suddenly. And the scuppers are the gutters that let the water out. So if it falls down, water comes up through the scuppers. So now there's even water on the deck. Okay. We were both of us capsized in a second, and both of us rolled almost together into the scuppers, the dead red cap with his arms still spread out, tumbling stiffly after us. So near were we, indeed, that my head came against the cozen's foot with a crack that made my teeth rattle. Blow and all, I was the first to foot again, for hands had got involved with the dead body. The sudden canting of the ship had made the deck no place for running on. I had to find some new way of escape, and that upon the instant, for my foe was almost touching me. Quick as thought, I sprang into the mizzen shrouds, rattled up hand for hand, and did not draw a breath till I was seated on the cross trees. Let me explain that. So with the boat, the deck is like this now, right? You can't run around on the deck now. So when it did that, all 3 people on board, including the one who's not even alive, rolled into each other and rolled down to the other side. And like Jim even gets a little bit hurt because he got his head hit the Israel Hand's foot, and so, but he gets up really fast. Israel is like kind of wrestling to get the dead body off of him to go after Jim, and so Jim, knowing that he can't just like run on the sideways deck, gets up into the what he calls the cross trees. The cross trees are like if you climb up the mast, if you go up like, and he talks about the shrouds, those are the sails. So if you kind of get in the sails and you climb up there, the cross tree is where the pole that goes across that holds the sail up in the mast. So he goes, because now that's at an angle too. It's not straight up anymore. So he gets up in there and he's on that. Okay, so that would be at an angle kind of like this. So not as hard to climb because of the angle. Is where he is now. Okay. I had been saved by being prompt. The dirk had struck, that's the dagger, the knife, right? The dirk had struck not half a foot below me as I pursued my upward flight, and there stood Israel Hands with his mouth open and his face upturned to mine, a perfect statue of surprise and disappointment. Now that I had a moment to myself, I lost no time in changing the priming of my pistol, and then, having one ready for service, and to make assurance doubly sure, I proceeded to draw the load of the other and recharge it afresh from the beginning. So Jim climbs up there and he gets his pistols out and quickly reprimes them. Okay, that's kind of technically difficult to do, but at least he's not, straight up and down now, sitting up there in the sail and up in the cross trees. My new employment struck Hands all of a heap. He began to see the dice going against him, and after an obvious hesitation, he also hauled himself heavily into the shrouds, and with the dirk in his teeth began slowly and painfully to mount. It cost him no end of time and groans to haul his wounded leg behind him, and I had quietly finished my arrangements before he was much more than a third of the way up. Then, with a pistol in either hand, I addressed him. So as Jim is loading his guns, Israel Hands, injured as he is, starts hauling himself up after him. It's very hard for him because he's in a lot of pain and he's older, and but he's a third of the way to Jim when Jim gets finished. And Jim says, "One more step, Mr. Hands," said I, "and I'll blow your brains out. Dead men don't bite, you know," I added with a chuckle. He stopped instantly. I could see by the working of his face that he was trying to think, and the process was so slow and laborious that, in my newfound security, I laughed aloud. At last, with a swallow or two, he spoke, his face still wearing the same expression of extreme perplexity. In order to speak, he had to take the dagger from his mouth, but in all else he remained unmoved. "Jim," says he, "I reckon we're fouled, you and me, and we'll have to sign articles. I'd have had you but for that there lurch, but I don't have no luck, not I, and I reckon I'll have to strike, which comes hard, you see, for a master mariner to a ship's younker like you, Jim." I was drinking in his words and smiling away, as conceited as a cock upon a wall, when all in a breath back went his right hand over his shoulder. Something sang like an arrow through the air. I felt a blow and then a sharp pang, and there I was pinned by the shoulder to the mast. In the horrid pain and surprise of the moment, I scarce can say it was by my own volition, and I am sure it was without a conscious aim. Both my pistols went off, and both escaped out of my hands. They did not fall alone. With a choked cry, the cozen loosed his grasp upon the shrouds and plunged head first into the water. Okay, so recap that one. Israel's like just chatting with him, and then all of a sudden throws that knife. The knife goes into Jim and pins him to the mast. And he's so scared and freaked out by it that he literally, he pulls the trigger and lets go of his guns. Okay, so they both go off and he drops them. And he also drops Israel Hands. And Israel goes straight into the water. Because remember, they're on the boat's like this, and so they're up onto the mast a little bit. And so below them is actually water. They clear, if he were to fall straight down, he'd be in the water. Okay. That concludes the chapter and the life of Israel Hands. And now our friend Jim has experienced one more weird, life-changing event. This time he didn't just witness a death, he caused it. It was to save his life. It was in self-defense. But certainly that has to be yet another traumatic event that Jim is going to have to get through. And now he's all alone again. All right. So make sure you go to your summary and that you get as much of the action as you can. I know that some of you are going to fight me on the how many characters to write about. I'm going to give you two choices for the third one. The dead body, O'Brien. Some things happen with it. And also you could use the Hispaniola as a character In this particular chapter, and in several of the other ones, the Hispaniola is so important that it could almost rate as a character in the story. And lots of things happen with it, and it does lots of things. So use that. There are so many words in here that you can use, words I didn't explain that you should probably write down and get a definition for. Do that. Make sure that you fill in information on every one of the questions. Let's just say that you don't think you wondered much. Okay, but that's an open spot to put some notes. So what could you wonder about? Like, I don't know, what was Israel Hand's family like? What happened to him to make him such a bad guy? You know, or maybe you wondered about how hard it was to prime a pistol in the 1700s, or I don't know, maybe you wondered about if the Hispaniola is going to have something broken on it because how it crashed a little. There's so many things that you can wonder about, and by doing that, engaging your brain with parts of the text that you don't know if anything's going to come up about those things, but by doing that, your brain pays just a little bit more attention, and you have a little better eye for detail as you go along. So please take your time to fill out the whole thing. We have one more chapter after this, and then we'll have completed part 5. So join me next time. And this one is called Pieces of 8. See you then.